Everyone, in this quick lecture, we're just going to take a look at really basic overview for how a dietary assessment is performed. So a dietary assessment is a way to answer this question: how do I know if I'm eating well? How do I know if my diet is healthy? There are two things we can talk about in terms of assessing dietary healthfulness. So one way is to collect dietary information from the person asking the question. So in the case of like a nutritionist or a dietitian, if a person was going to go see a dietitian or a nutritionist, the nutritionist would ask for some sort of diet history. And so that can look like a day-by-day food diary where the person tracks the foods and the beverages that they consume, tries to include the amount of each food, or at least approximate amounts, potentially also the time of day of food intake, and maybe also some other things like where was the person when they were eating, what were they doing, were they involved in other things while they were eating, or were they just sitting down and eating? And it might also ask for information on bowel movements, as bowel movement is the end process of nutrition. Another way to collect diet history or diet information is through something called a food frequency questionnaire. In this short course, we're not going to use a food frequency questionnaire. This is usually like a 30 some odd page form where a person goes through and answers sort of like various very specific questions about different types of food intakes and the quality of the intake, and they can answer on this scale of never, almost never, sometimes, often, or almost always. So a food frequency questionnaire is one of those types of forms. Again, it can take quite a while to fill out. And a food frequency questionnaire is just it's basically food, it's recall. So a person is sort of assessing, okay, over the past week, over the past couple of weeks, this is what my eating patterns have looked like. And there's not much individuality to a food frequency questionnaire because it's just generic questions. And then there's also a 24-hour food recall. So in the case that somebody forgets to do their diet diary or their food diary, a nutritionist or a dietitian might just ask the person, okay, tell me everything that you ate in the last 24 hours. So start from, breakfast yesterday to your last meal at the end of the day. All of these have their limitations and of course their uses as well. My preference is to do a food diary where someone is tracking their intake day by day, meal by meal. That seems to be the best and most accurate, but it's also relying on the trustworthiness or the honesty of the person doing the recording. So some people sometimes don't want to jot down everything that they're eating, so they might omit it from the diary. But the same could go for the food frequency questionnaire. The person, we could just not be fully honest in answering the questions, and same with a food recall. The diet diary is nice because it's happening in the moment, whereas the food frequency questionnaire and the 24-hour food recall are both happening after the fact. So it's also relying on the person's memory. Those are kind of the two major limitations with those. And then the second part of answering this question is to do a dietary analysis. And in the analysis, we compare the intake of the person to the recommendations for healthful intake. And we haven't looked at macronutrients and micronutrients yet, but this should make decent sense even before we get to those two concepts. But we can look at recommended intakes for our different macronutrients and recommended intakes for our different micronutrients. And then again, draw the comparison from those recommended standards to what the person actually consumed. So in order to know, the dietary reference intake values, these are the recommendations for our macronutrients and our micronutrients. So these are reference values that can be used to plan and assess the healthfulness of people's food intake. These values do vary by age, and they also vary by sex, by male, female. The Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine is the body that writes these recommendations. This is a non-government organization, and it's basically a research organization. So this is separate from the dietary guidelines for Americans, although the two are used hand in hand in clinical nutrition. But worth noting that this is written by a separate entity than the federal government. Yeah, so let's look at what the dietary reference index values are. So we have two specific different types of reference intake values for our macronutrients, and our macronutrients are the nutrients that provide energy to the body, and these are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So one value is called the estimated energy requirement, and this value is based on age, not gender, but sex, weight, height, and physical activity levels. I actually just copy pasted this from the website. So that's interesting. That's needs to be updated. And the estimated energy requirement refers to the average daily calorie intake that's required to maintain healthful energy balance. So the average amount of calories that a person needs to consume to keep their body in a happy, healthy equilibrium in terms of the amount of energy that they're expending through work and exercise relative to the amount of energy that they're consuming through the foods they're taking in. And then the second reference intake value for energy is what's called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And this is a percentage of total calories that each macronutrient should provide daily. So what percent of total calories should carbohydrates provide? What percent of total calories should fat provide? What percent of total calories should protein provide? And these ranges are associated with lower risk and lower incidence of chronic disease. So the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is the same regardless of the person, regardless of their height, regardless of their age, regardless of their sex, regardless of their activity level. The AMDRs just sort of stays the same. And I don't think I've written this into the PowerPoint, but the AMDR for carbohydrate is at 45 to 65% of a person's total daily calories should be provided by the calories in carbohydrates. For fat, the AMDR is 20 to 35%. So 20 to 35% of a person's total caloric intake should come from fat. And then for protein, it is a larger range. So it's from 10 to 35% of a person's total daily caloric intake should come from protein foods. While the AMDR, that's just set, it doesn't change. It's obviously written in a range. So that means that it can change, you can move within those ranges, like someone who is doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise, like maybe practicing for running a marathon or doing a triathlon, that person might want to eat higher in the carbohydrate range, so maybe more like 65% of their total caloric intake. Whereas somebody who is trying to compete for world's strongest man or woman would probably want to eat more like 30% of their calories from protein. So there is flexibility within the AMDR. Whereas with estimated energy requirement, that is just specific to each individual person. So there's no sort of guideline, there's no categories or ranges. There's actually a very specific equation, and you plug in your age, your sex, your height, your weight, and your physical activity level, and then into this equation, and then you'll get the estimated energy requirement from that. So EER is very specific to each person, and then AMDR is just a set of ranges. And both of these are specific to carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And then we have our dietary reference intake values for specifically our micronutrients. Some of these also encompass protein and carbohydrate and fat, but these are more specific to vitamins and minerals. So we have the recommended daily allowance. This is the average amount of a nutrient that is required to meet the nutrient needs of 97 to 98% of the population for that specific nutrient. So for vitamin C, for example, or vitamin D, or calcium or iron or magnesium, the RDA is to say, okay, roughly every person, or at least 97 to 98% of people, need at least this amount, which is the RDA, in order to maintain good health. Then we also have the estimated average requirement, and this is the average daily intake required to meet the needs of only 50% of the population. So RDA is best if we have an RDA established, but this is all based on nutrition research and nutrition science. So in some cases, we just don't have enough information or a large enough body of information about a specific nutrient. So in the case where we do have a lot of scientific background and scientific knowledge, then an RDA has been established. And when we have slightly less information, we tend to use the EAR. And then when we have very little information about a nutrient, we will, adequate intake is the reference value that's applied. So adequate intake is just to say, it seems to be that if a person takes in at least this much of this nutrient, they should be, at a reduced disease risk and should be in general good health. And then there's still one other reference intake value, which is the tolerable upper limit. And this is a really interesting one because these other three are referring to the minimum requirement. The tolerable upper limit is to say that intake above this amount could be potentially harmful. So it's recommended to not take in more than this amount. There is not a tolerable upper limit established for every nutrient. Again, it's just based on what information we have. So for some nutrients, we don't really have a large enough body of information yet. And so an upper limit has not been established. But there are also some nutrients, like several of our B vitamins, don't actually have an established upper limit because the body is pretty efficient at processing out and getting rid of any excesses or any excess of that nutrient. So most of our micronutrients have an RDA. A lot of them also have an EAR. Some of them only have an adequate intake, and some of them also, in addition to RDA or adequate intake, some of them also have a tolerable upper limit level. And again, some carbohydrates and proteins have an RDA. There has not been an RDA established for fats. And then adequate intake and upper limit, none of these have been established for carbohydrate, protein, or fat. Except for things like saturated fat and trans fat, we don't always refer to as a tolerable upper limit intake, but those recommendations to keep intake below these levels, you could argue that acts roughly as an upper limit reference for certain types of fats. If you're interested, you can click on this link. I figured I wouldn't paste it directly into this slide, but you can go through, because if you click on this link, it'll take you to all the different tables for all these different dietary reference intake values. So you'll be able to see the different reference intakes for the macronutrients based on age, based on male, female, and you'll also be able to see the RDA, the EAR, the adequate intake, and the tolerable upper limit for 30 plus different vitamins and minerals. So we can use those dietary reference intake values to assess, how much is a person taking in and how does it compare to the established recommended levels. In order to know how much a person is taking in, we would have to actually do, how do I want to say, a more technical assessment of their diet than just looking at it on paper. And so we're in really fortunate times because there are a lot of free apps on the internet now or on your phone that can do a pretty thorough assessment of your individual micronutrient and macronutrient intake levels. Otherwise, and historically, these types of tools and this type of information has been not always accessible to the public and had only been accessible to dietary or nutrition professionals. But I'd say definitely over the last 10 years, 5 years for sure, these tools have become much more available to the general public. So one of the tools I really like to use, it's very thorough and very user-friendly, is Cronometer. And I will ask you to use this tool for your second diet assessment and analysis. So again, feel free to, and please do, click this link and play around with Cronometer. You can plug in what you're actually eating, or you can just kind of make up some foods, and you'll start to generate some information that looks like this. So I don't have everything on here because I couldn't just obviously fit it all into the page, but there's quite a bit here. So you'll see as you start to plug in your food for the day, you'll start to see how your total carbohydrate intake is adding up. You'll start to see how your total fat intake is adding up. You'll start to see how your total protein intake is adding up. And then you'll see different vitamins and minerals as well. So you'll start to see, okay, wow, cool, I have already consumed over 1,000% of the recommended vitamin A for today. I've got almost all the vitamin B3 and B5 that I need for today. I have had plenty of manganese. But yeah, it looks like I could still eat a little more fat, protein, and carbohydrate, all three of those. So again, this is just a super handy tool to help us see, and this is showing us two things at once. It's showing us how much we're taking in, and then it's already doing the comparison for us to the recommended intake levels. So that's what these graphs are on the right, and on the left, the individual column with the grams or the micrograms or the milligrams. This is what has actually been consumed. So play around with that. If you have questions, definitely feel free to email me. You're not required to use that tool for another couple of weeks, but I definitely recommend playing around with it now just to check it out and see all there is to be gleaned from it. I threw these two slides back on here. So for your first diet assessment and analysis, I just want you to compare your total intake of servings for the different food groups. So fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins. And I actually don't ask you to track your dairy, but you can if you want to. And instead of tracking dairy, I ask you to track your water intake, which also isn't on here, but if I plugged it into the instructions for week 1, what your target water intake should be. And also when you read on the links to Harvard Health for week 1, you'll see a more thorough explanation of water intake recommendations. The reason I don't have you track milk is because there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not it's truly a necessary food for humans, because typically we're drinking bovine or cow's milk. And obviously we're not cows. So there's a lot of controversy about the healthfulness of bovine milk in the human diet. And as we saw in Canada's food guide, and as we see on the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, milk isn't there. It doesn't have its own place. It can be a part of the protein tally, like it can be considered a protein food, but it's not given its own separate recommendation. So that's what I'm encouraging you to do for your diet assessment and analysis number 1, is to, rather than track milk separately, consider it a protein food. And then the beverage that I want you to be tracking is water. So you can use this slide and the previous slide if they're helpful to kind of remind yourself, okay, what is a serving of fruit? And again, the recommendation is 4 servings of fruit per day, 5 servings vegetable per day, 6 servings grain per day, 5.5 servings protein per day. And then the recommendation for water is about at least 72 ounces a day for women, and 104 ounces a day for men. So I ask you to track your food for 3 days and also include rough amounts if you can get an estimate for how much of each thing you're eating at each meal. Do also track your beverages and track your water. And then at the end of 3 days, come back and compare it to the serving size recommendations and the number of servings per day. And then the second assessment and analysis, which we'll do in weeks 3 and 4, we'll use the Chronometer app and look more specifically at your micronutrient intake. So looking at your vitamin and mineral intake. All right, that's it for this. Thanks.